Thank you very much for those kind words. I should point out that this whole thing started with my friend Stephen Dalton, who was talking. I heard a talk that he gave about the Hoofdville farm, which is in our Constantia area, and I said to him, "Why don't you come and talk to VASSA about it?" And he said, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea." And then we realized that the house, the main farmhouse there, has actually been knocked down. And this is an architectural society, so I thought maybe we should expand it and look at the few houses that still exist in that area, in the lower Constantia area. And that was fine. So I know that there were some near to where we live, and I found out some information about them. And after a while it became apparent that there was just too much information for one talk. So we divided it into two, and I've got the starting section for you. Part one is going to be Weltevreden, Skilpadvlei and Timor Hall, and I think we visited Timor Hall some years ago. Part two will be about the Hoofdville area, not just the main farm but the subdivisions. We refer back to this base map time and time again because it gives us a nice indication of those four farm areas. You can see how quite large they are. What is interesting, if one goes back, you can see that this road here, Hoofdville Road, is now called Dordrecht Road. So the names have changed as well, possibly because of the war years when German things were not terribly popular, and maybe it got changed. Okay. There's a talk, a thing that occurs from time to time here, the talk about quit rent and what quit rent means. And Sir John Craddock in 1813 had a proclamation, and he replaced loan farms, Leningsplaats or Erfpacht, with perpetual quit rent. And he thought that these two were equivalent. But in English law, as you can read there, quit rent denotes freehold tenure, and you still pay to the lord of the manor so that you don't have to give him any more services or dues. And it's not quite the same. It's because it's freehold, whereas Erfpacht is a lease system, and you don't own the ownership. So before 1886, everybody knew that Erfpacht meant that the government did not give you ownership of the land. And then in 1886, Lord de Villiers suddenly decided that no, quit rent, perpetual quit rent, means that you become the owner of the land. And this caused enormous confusion. And interestingly, the Cape Register of Deeds decided to hell with that. They were going to stay with the old definition. And so an Erfpacht brief or a quit rent lease is not regarded as ownership. What was interesting is that you could not sell the land, but you could sell the buildings and the improvements that you had made on the land, so that there was a transfer from one person to another, and they obviously took over the quit rent lease. Okay, enough background. This is an interesting little map which shows the dates of the Cape quit rent files for each of these farms, and you see they're all around the 1880s, but that's got nothing to do with when the farm was first started, which was in many cases much earlier than that. However, not that much earlier, because many of the houses are typical of the one that you're now seated in, and I thought, well, okay, fine, we'll find out the date, and that'll give me a benchmark for similar looking houses. But unfortunately, it ain't that easy. And there's a book that was written, or an article that was written by Margaret Cairns some years ago about the Athenaeum. It used to be called, or there was a house here called La Rochelle, which burnt down in 1889. And there's no report anywhere of what the new building was or any plans for it. There were plans for a double-story building, but that never happened. And in 1893, in the Cape Town Street Guide, it was listed as Lockerbie House. So we know that sometime before 1893, this house was built. So it's turn of the century, just before the 1900s. Here's another map that I got from Mr. Crawford of Crawford Blinds, company still exists, when electricity was being supplied to the various farms. And you can see the blue line which shows the electricity supplied to his particular farm. But luckily for me, it also has a number of other little farms mentioned. I don't know if you can read them. Most of those we were able to track down, except for the one at the far end there. There are two, both called the Vines. And the Vines for H. Whiting we could find, but there's no trace of J. Dumini's vine, so I couldn't find where that was. But I did discover that J. A. Dumini was in quite a lot of trouble with the council for erecting corrugated iron sheds along Boundary Road. Okay, that's as far as that one went. Let's start with Weltevreden, granted to Jan Bernhard Hoffmann in 1813, and he added it to a place called Hersteller, which sort of means a repairer. In other words, a place you could go to recover from maybe some injury or something, and that later became Timor Hall. Hersteller was sold to Edward George in 1816, and he went bankrupt in 1835. Don't worry about it, we'll get to a whole lot more detail for him later. This portion was then sold to Thomas Friedrich Dreyer in 1836 and transferred to Martinus Wilhelmus de Kock in 1874, and that's the name that you see on that 1931 map. Here you can see the diagrams. I hope you can see the diagrams. I've had to turn them because you see the north pointer was sort of skew on the page, but that five-sided property you can see there. And the same thing there at a later stage was sold to Thomas Friedrich Dreyer Sr. And when you try to follow these families to find out who got it later, you discover that Thomas Friedrich Dreyer had a son called Thomas Friedrich Dreyer. And their various children got married and had sons called Thomas Friedrich Dreyer. So it's very involved and somewhat confusing. What is interesting, if you can read this, but you possibly can't, can anybody read this? Okay. What you see, this is the death notice of Martinus Wilmot de Kock in this terrible handwriting. But the pointing thing is that he died in 1899 at his residence, Weltevreden, in the district of Weinberg. So this was his death notice. So that means that the house Weltevreden existed before 1899. We don't know when it was actually built. If we go back, it may be between 1836 and 1899, but that is quite a wide area. Unfortunately, many of these houses that we deal with here, you can't actually pin down when they were actually built. So this is the Weltevreden site again. If we look at it from the aerial photograph, and the aerial photographs unfortunately only start in 1945 for this particular area, but you can see that there are a number of farmhouses. Most of it was just vineyards, just vines everywhere you look. But you see there's a few little farmhouses that are set here, and some lines that are fairly distinct, which later turn out to be developments. And what is interesting is, if you look at the 1880 deed granting the perpetual quit rent to Martinus Wilhelmus de Kock, you see this drawing here, and it shows you the names of the neighbours. And interestingly, this little one down the bottom here, property of Mr. Lowe. So make a note of that. We'll get to Mr. Lowe later. But that's the drawing, and you can see the house is shown in the middle. It just says house, and there's two little blobs there, which sort of represent the farmhouse, we hope. But if you go to the Surveyor-General's office, you see exactly the same diagram, except they've coloured it all in and divided it up. And this is something that's very annoying. As you look at these old drawings, many of them have subdivisions shown on them, which tie up with the subdivision written on the back of the document many years later. So it gives you an unfair feel for how it was when it was actually granted. But anyway, you've got a number of lots that are shown here, and the house is shown in lot AC, so maybe that's where the Weltevreden house would be. It fits nicely onto the aerial photograph as we saw before. So if we zoom in on that area, which is roughly where the house was indicated, you find this little thing here in 1829. And then again, later, if you check on the earth numbers for any of those houses, you get this little development here. And you can see that there are other portions here and other farms, Hillcrest and Fairview, noted around it. And the funny thing is that turns out to be the vines. It's not Weltevreden. And there you can see the shape of that property, the red lines, and the house is there. So obviously I got into the car and drove off to find it, and there it is, the vines. So it couldn't be more obvious. And there it is in 1963, and you see it had quite a lot of wooden sort of brookie lace around the roofs, the eaves here, and these little spikes and so on. And now we can see what it looks like today, which is similar but a bit more austere. Okay, and this is the Google viewpoint of it, which is interesting for a number of reasons. This is the house itself. This one beside it is called Kleinvines, and apparently that's where the manager of the farm used to live in the old days. And the old barn is this building here that's now been converted into a residence. There's Kleinvines. And let's look a bit harder to find out where Weltevreden is. And it's also, you see, my subtitle, Skoon Farm, which is a bit weird. And I found this terrible map which you can't really read, but I managed to draw all the lines and so on, and you can see that the red houses are ones that were in existence when this subdivision into a township was being proposed in 67. And if you plot them onto reality, you can see where they are, and that shows you where those houses are. So the ones at the top I went and had a look at there, and they're fairly modern, there's nothing much to see there. But the one down the bottom where it says residences turned up again in this general plan. I found a much better plan of the 67 development. And the interesting thing is that at the top there, it says that this is the remainder of Lot Skoon in Deep River. And you can see this particular house on that plot is shown there. And there's that sort of hiccup that we saw on the vines area that went around that. And yes, okay, so the red house is in this little area, in that huge property. And you can see the various roads that exist today. Old Kendall Road is around that. Kendall Road on the bottom, Long Street and Boundary Road. And this little piece here in 1889 I show you because it shows where the senior de Kock granted him to his son Joseph de Kock. And there are houses that are mentioned, that are shown there in 1889. So the building for Weltevreden was already there. And the funny thing, the Skoon worried me because surely it should be Skoonvrucht because the Skoonvrucht Avenue is right there. And I talked to the owners about it and they said, no. Skoonvrucht is the name of the family who owned the farm. And the lot Skoon was just a way of referring to it. And when they purchased it in 1996, it looked like that. And they said that the granny Skoonvrucht who lived there, who was about 97, had lived there all her life. So that takes you back to the turn of the century. And it is today. They've tidied it up a little bit and replaced, put some brookie lace on the pillars, the columns. But it's nice. And they used to have a nice brass nameplate on the gate, and of course it got stolen soon after they'd moved in. Here again you can see the house from Google Earth, and on the right hand side that green thing there is the barn that's also been converted into a residence. So let's look at Fairview, right up the top there in the 1958 aerial photograph, and there's the chunk of land that they built it on. What's interesting is down the bottom, it says here, situate in Deep River near Rathfelder's Hotel in the Cape Division. So it was relatively close to what is today the Rathfelder. And in 1964 there was this survey done to check probably on development. And if we zoom in on that particular area, you can see that the farmhouses still exist, virtually unchanged. And it's still called Fairview Farm, still there. The people were quite reluctant to let me in for some strange reason, just to take a photograph, but eventually I managed to persuade them. And this one here, I had to take two pictures and join them together, but it gives you a nice idea of what the old farmhouse looked like. And there's still a lot of, I was going to say industrial, but really residential buildings behind there that probably had farm workers staying there. Hillcrest was right next to that, and it's a very strange looking lump of land. And if you look here, this lot was part of a farm called Longville, and that was then incorporated when it was developed. And there you can see Fairview is at the top, Hillcrest next to it, and just vines everywhere, and one little farmhouse in the middle there. And then in 68, when it was turned into a township, Constantia Township Extension 17, what you can see that's immediately obvious is that this chunk of land here is bigger than all the rest. Why? Because that's where the old farmhouse was and is. And there it is still today. They told me, the owners told me that they thought it might be a Herbert Baker house, but I rather don't think that's probably a fairy tale. Okay, Oak Farm. If you look at Weltevreden on the map, down the bottom here, this part is Oak Farm, and for some reason that's all now included in Weltevreden, although the original Weltevreden was just around the top there. And you can see the Oak Farm drawing in 1887, and that little red bit there, unfortunately, is more or less where Kendall Road goes today, so that's obviously been knocked down. But the interesting thing about it is that in 1839, it was granted to Janet Lowe, married to J. Townsend, and others in 1839. And the question is, no, the and others is, you know what I mean. But the funny thing is, why would the land be granted to Janet Lowe? And who the hell was she anyway? And I looked her up, and I found the deed of transfer, which has all this detail. And the important thing is that these are the joint trustees of the insolvent estate of Edward George. Now, we heard about him before, and we'll get to him again. And they ceded and transferred it to John Patterson, Mark Patterson, and James Lowe as father of his minor children, James Lowe, Elizabeth Lowe, Johanna Lowe, and Janet Lowe. So that's where the Janet comes from. And it turns out that she was still a minor at this stage. And, there's a perpetual quit rent agreement in 87, and it's in Deep River called Oak Farm. But you notice that there's no mention of any payment. Now, all the other subdivisions, when this guy's property was sold off when he was bankrupt, everybody else's deed of sale or deed of transfer has specific mention of how much they paid for it. And it was in Rix dollars or in Cape Guilders. But here there's no mention of any payment at all, and I still can't figure out why, but there you go. Okay, let's look at Janet Townsend again. She married John Townsend, and she was originally Lowe with an E on the end. Because you can hardly read the writing, I've typed it out here. 24th of December, 1855. He was a widower and a clerk, and he worked at the Spektakel Kopermijn in Komaggas. Now that's Doorngon in the Northern Cape. It's there's nothing much there. There's a little village basically. It's a mine, and it was one of the world's biggest copper mines at that time. Okay, now I don't expect you to read all this little lot. I'm going to read out to you his timeline. Jonathan Townsend is really quite interesting. Born in England, arrived in Cape Town 1821, and his brother was already here. So T and J Townsend were silversmiths in Cape Town. And Townsend silver, if you can find it, is extremely valuable. It's also extremely rare. Then he married Elizabeth Bowman, who later had 13 children. In 28, he was summoned to the Supreme Court for outstanding stamp duty. He petitioned the Colonial Secretary for permission to open a pawn shop in 1833. In 1837, he was at Market Square, manufacturer and importer. In 1838, he was the master of the Union Lodge in Cape Town. In 1839, he pensioned the governor Napier to waive a fine for not having a retail license. He also traded as Bevel and Townsend, auctioneers and appraisers in the Herengracht. Then he withdrew from those partnerships and sold his house and the George's Hotel, which he also owned, in the Herengracht and Long Market. Then he entered into a partnership with Denace Brothers & Co., auctioneers and appraisers in the Herengracht. He lived in Rondebosch. He petitioned the governor to waive a fine for failing to renew a license. He was summoned to the Supreme Court for defamatory remarks against Thomas Tweedy. And eventually, Elizabeth Townsend died at age 37 at her home in Rondebosch. That's not the end of the story. In 1847, he married Janet Harriet Lowe in Kamachas, Namaqualand. Their son was born. He summoned the Supreme Court about mortgages. He petitioned Sir Harry Smith for position as a land surveyor, which was refused. He traded as Townsend and Littlejohn, a hotel keeper at Phoenix Hotel, Bree Street. He was served a summons in 1851 for non-payment of a promissory note. Malcolm Littlejohn had left for England after having had an affair with his daughter, Mary Ann Georgina, who had a son born in Swellendam. He lived in Castle Street at that side. Then he moved to Namaqualand, and he was a witness at the marriage of Mary Ann Georgina and Josiah Husband in Clanwilliam. Thereafter, he was a manager of the Spectacle Mine. He had a daughter, Agnes. He had a son, John, another son, Henry, a son, Thomas, baptized in Springbok. He then was a general dealer in Springbok. Another daughter, Elizabeth Townsend, another son, Richard Townsend, and a daughter, Jeanette Isabella, born. And he was a member of the Divisional Council. Finally, in 1868, he was declared insolvent in a government gazette, and he owed Josiah Husband £3,235, 6 shillings and 11 pence, which is quite a lot of money. 1868, he was listed as a retail dealer at Chapel Street, Cape Town. He petitioned the Secretary of the Government, Southey, for post as a messenger, a jailer, or anything, and was unsuccessful. He wrote to Southey from Deep River, applying for a position as a jailer in Worcester, refused. He lived at Rudebloem in Cape Town. And then in 1872 to 73, again, he was a mine agent for the copper mining company in Springbok. Another daughter was baptized. He then had a retail wine license at number 610 Street. In 1875, listed as a greengrocer in 49 Rose Street. And luckily he died then, otherwise the story would just go on and on. 1887, Janet Townsend is listed as a general dealer in Main Road, Plumstead. She died age 58 in 1888. Her story is a bit sad. She was born in Cape Town, Janet Harriet Lowe. She was baptized Janet Harriet Lowe with an E. She signed herself Janet Lowe on her marriage document, which we saw earlier. In the deed of transfer, she's named Janet Lowe. On her children's birth record, she's called Jeanette Townsend. And then on her gravestone, she's called Janet, with double T, Henrietta, which isn't her name, Townsend. And that's a bit sad. Okay, this guy's death notice just shows children by his first wife on this side, children by his second wife on that side, and whether the deceased left property. A few things, apparently, principally clothing, sent to the widow in Cape Town, where I believe there is a will. And then in the newspaper, there was this announcement that he had his 24th child. They didn't all live, but okay. And he was the chief agent of the copper mining company at Springbok. Now, you can't see the detail here, but I just want to show you roughly who married who and how it worked. Firstly, at the top there, we've got Joanna Rosina Hildebrand, who married a John Patterson. You remember Patterson coming from that deed earlier. And they had 3 children. Then he died, and she married James Lowe, the owner of Oak Farm, or at least the guy who lived at Oak Farm, and he was there until 1847. She died, and then he married Jane Rebecca Bowman, we saw in that before, and they had some children. Then, excuse me, Mr. Lowe died, and she married Mark Patterson, and they had some children. And then John Townsend, the son of James Lowe, married Elizabeth Bowman, and the reason that it's there is, you'll see later, and they had all these children, and then she died, so he married our Janet there, and had all these children. And one of the other children of James Lowe married Elizabeth Dorothea here, and then he married Antoinette Henrietta Verkeil, and they had other children, and a Joanna Lowe here had a Henry Charles Church, and she married a Carl Klink when this husband died, and he murdered that uncle of his at some later stage. It was just a knife fight, and he got killed accidentally. So, a complicated story. And you see down the bottom here you've got a Richard Townsend, and a junior Richard Townsend, and a Walter Henry Townsend, and we'll see him later. Okay, this is the 1813 lease of that funny-shaped five-sided property. And of course it's all in Dutch, because 1813 was just after the Dutch ownership or whatever of the Cape, before it was given back to the English. And you can see there was a perpetual quit-rent lease to Jan Bernard Hoffman, which we spoke about earlier, transferred to Edward George. The top sections were, well, you can read that for yourself. And the interesting thing is that these notes here were written onto that Dutch document in English at a later date. So it gives you some of the history of the land. And this little tiny piece down the bottom there, where we had a Mr. Lowe living, you can see is the same as the Oak Farm area. Okay, this is not the diagram that you saw before. It's slightly different, and it's part of Weltevreden that was transferred to Richard Townsend. You see his name down the bottom, and it's part of Weltevreden. Okay, so this is what Oak Farm looked like, and it's in two portions. And you can see the dotted line separating those two portions, and the funny shaped piece here is the bit that was developed into a housing estate later on. That's what it is today, and you still see there's a lot of green around it still today, behind the Herzliya School. And that was developed as Oak Ridge Township Extension 1, which rang a bell. Now, wait a minute, if that's Extension 1, where the hell was the Oak Ridge Township itself? Anyway, here is the Townsend farmhouse, which still exists today, and it's a nice old-looking building. And next door to it is a house that was built for a daughter who apparently didn't live there. So, and that's called La Petite Constantia. You've seen it on Kendall Road, Old Kendall Road. Okay, this diagram here, which has north in that direction, is drawn facing east, and I don't know why, and I can't find the original. In fact, I went to the Surveyor-General's office to find the original drawing for this plan, because it's much bigger. And they could show me a later one, which didn't have all the detail that's written on here, and that was no use to me. And then I went to the archives, and they happened actually to have a copy of the original drawing. So I was able to take a copy of that and give it back to the Register's Deeds office. And it shows you Oak Farm there, and further down you've got Retreat Farm. And what is interesting about it is that on the diagram there's a little farmhouse shell there. And why do I show you that? Because this is what the Retreat Farm looked like. Oak Farm is up the top there. And what is interesting is that portion 1 and portion 2 are somehow shown as separate from lot 1 and 2. and that wasn't obvious why that should be. And it was granted to Duncan Ferguson, born in Scotland, married a Barbara McCausland Johnson in 1881. Retreat Farm was granted to him in that year, and the farmhouse was shown in the 1887 diagram. He died, and Barbara died in 1924. They had two sons, Charles Duncan and Alexander, and a daughter, Barbara. Now remember that one. Alexander married Violet Gray Smart in 1921 and farmed at Retreat Farm, Deep River. Charles Duncan went up country slightly. When Alexander Ferguson died, his widow was the sole heir. The farm was auctioned off, and Mr. Townsend of W.H. Townsend, you remember whose name was down here earlier on, purchased the farm for £6,000, and the Oak Ridge Township was established in 1967. And this is a terrible diagram, and I can't make it any brighter, but what you see is that the whole of the farm was developed except for portions 1 and portion 2. And there's portion 1, and there's portion 2, and that little house there you can find on the 1945 aerial photograph, and surrounded by just vineyards, nothing else. And then in 1953, there's another house that popped up. So whether there was a connection between the two, I don't know. But this is the original farmhouse. And if we follow that through in 1968, you see this encroaching development here. And in 1980, it looks a little different. The vineyards have just about disappeared. And the house is there today. And there it is. And I had great difficulty trying to get a photograph of that because the owner was overseas and his tenants refused to let me come onto the property until they'd contacted him, which was fine, except that he said no, and I had to wait till he came back to this country, and finally I managed to actually get to talk to him, and he showed me the house and let me take some pictures, and you can see the old front door of that farmhouse. What is interesting is that it's got the vines in the front there, and if you look in the Google picture, you can see it's just covered in greenery. Okay, and what is interesting, if you remember that daughter Barbara Ferguson, on one of the front windows she scratched her name. Unfortunately, it's a lousy photograph, but very difficult. The camera didn't want to focus on that. Okay, whilst we're down there, let's just look at Morning Star and Mountain View. In 1880, there was this property granted firstly in 1814 to Mr. Dean, then transferred to H. van der Schyff. In 1881, it was transferred to H.J.W. van der Schyff, and I don't know if it's the same van der Schyff. I rather think it is. And you can see on this 1880 diagram, there's a house shown there, and this is Mountain View. And then, apparently, he transferred part to his son, Daniel van der Schyff, and the remainder is called Morning Star. So that's Mountain View, and this bit here is now called Morning Star. And you can see on the 1945 aerial photograph, there are the two houses, quite clearly seen, and they're still there today. And the development, this is now at an angle, you can see there isn't even a north pointer, but it's just shown skew. This is the large property, which means that's where the farmhouse is likely to be. And there it is, again on Google Earth. And I tried to talk to the owner. You can see that the lawn is sort of almost non-existent. And down the bottom here, there's a swimming pool. This brown stuff is water. These are the two barns. And people who knew the Townsend told me that they used to have parties there, and Richard Townsend was the DJ at the time. And at the back there, that's called Morning Star Cottage, and that's the old stables which have now been converted into living accommodation. And this lot, I couldn't get permission to go and talk to that, to take a picture of that guy. He refused to let me onto his site. And I said, but why? I just want to take a photo. No, he said, private property. Okay. So after some weeks, I talked to a neighbour who my sister-in-law happens to know, and stuck my camera over the fence, and there's the house. But you see, the poor thing is falling apart. I mean, you know, the fascia boards have gone, and it's really a mess. It needs some TLC. Okay, that's Morning Star. And then the other house that he gave to his son is on this property here, which is further up in that same area. The public place, this is a big open area here, and the house is there. That was quite interesting because when I buzzed on the intercom at the gate and told them my spiel, I was from VASSA, blah, 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 and could I come and take a photograph of the house? And they said, no, I'm sorry, we're having a family crisis. And I said, well, I didn't quite hear what she said. I said, can I come back tomorrow? She said, didn't you hear what I said? We're having a family crisis. So I haven't gone near it again. Okay, but you notice that they're all in the same style, the turn of the century style. Kendall is another one, which one doesn't realize is actually a farm, Kendall. And there it is in the 58 picture, which is, I don't show the 1945 one because it's a bit fuzzy. You can see Hillcrest there, Kendall Road, and the whole farm called Kendall, and the house clearly marked there. And in the diagram for this in 1958, it's divided into these 5 strange shaped plots, slightly wiggled, some of them. And if you take those close up, you can see there are houses shown on those portions. And if you plonk it onto today's map, that tells you exactly where the old farmhouse is, and there it is. So I went to talk to the lady, and you can see the farmhouse is there. There's the barn again next door, which seems to be standard practice, and that's what it looks like today. And a giveaway is sometimes these large palm trees. If you see huge palm trees of that type, it usually means it's a pretty old property. Okay, so we've now covered Fairview, Hillcrest, the Vines, Scoon, Kendall and Oak Farm, Mountain View and Morning Star down the bottom there. Okay, there they're shown. In the 1953 picture, it was still vines everywhere. Okay, let's move on to Skilpadvlei. Part of it was granted to Versveld in 1837, another part granted to P.J. Hooft in 1839, and then transferred to a Henry Clutie, and Lot D on that particular plot was granted to Hendrik Clutie, who is referred to as Jack's son, just presumably there's some confusion, in 1887. So there's the map with various little houses shown on it. And if we go to one of the earth drawings, you find all these lines that have been added, which are later subdivisions. So they came after 1887. And you see it's surrounded by Alphen at the top there, Hoofdville, Timmerhall, Weltevreden, Sillery here, and Longville down there. And this is Silverhurst. Okay, so that's the bit granted to J.H. Versveld, transferred to Hooft, transferred to Clutie. That bit granted to Hooft, transferred to Clutie. Then Thomas Brink got that top section, 1896, and the little annex, that little bit on the corner there for some strange reason. The bottom section here in 1898, which is called Panorama, and also Lot C, somewhat confusingly. That little bit there became Barbarossa. That whole chunk there became Withycombe, given to Captain Pay in 1902. That was what Walloon looked like in 1922. And then the owner of Walloon gave some to his son, which is that blue bit up the top, in 1946. The Divisional Council took a chunk off the bottom here. The Walloon Township was developed there. And then finally Walloon had a subdivision, and this section also surveyed, presumably also for subdivision. So there we have the actual picture. And you can see various areas where there are farms, and the ones that I've mentioned, and that one up the top there called Vergezicht as well. Okay, if we look at Walloon, which is the name of the old Skilpadvlei farmhouse, It was consolidated and owned by Hendrik Kluti, one of the Klutis, owned by Brink in 96. In 1922 it was sold to a magistrate Rousseau, who renamed the farm Walloon. Why, I don't know. And in 28 it was sold to Mr. Schudding, and a portion called Sunrise. And the thing is that Mr. Schudding was not a Walloon, but he didn't change the name. You know, Walloon is people living in one half of Belgium, and there's a bit of animosity between the two different groups. And he created the front door, and the original doors came from the Cape of Good Hope Savings Bank building. This is all from their website, by the way. He sold a portion to his son Douglas, and a 15-acre portion was transferred in 1948 to Sir Vaas Malherbe, and it became a property of his son, and later subdivided for a housing estate. So that's where the plot is today. And you can see Walloon houses down the bottom here, and it looks kind of nice. And it's rented out. You can hire it for a large number of people, in fact. Big old kitchen. Okay, Barbarossa. We've all heard of Barbarossa, and I know that the area on the Hoofdwil side of Dordrecht Road is called Barbarossa, which is completely wrong. Barbarossa was never there. It was never on that side of Dordrecht Road. It was on this side. And Barbarossa does not mean Redbeard the pilot. It's a red grape variety, an Italian grape variety. So that was owned by Schikkeling. In 1908, the homestead was built and sold to Lateghan. The homestead in 3 acres was rented to the Skeels family, and they will crop up again when we get to Hoopville, which will come in the second talk. In 1948, the homestead was altered, restored, and sold to Norton, and then sold to Vernacular, and then in 1964, the workshop was converted to a cottage and named Camelot. So there's the rather strange-looking shape of the property, and it was broken up into a housing estate, and again you can see the large central area which the owner obviously decided to hang on to, and that's what the house looked like way back when. And you see it's got these interesting bay windows on each side, this side and around there. And today, after the 1948 alterations, they've stretched it so that the bay windows have been taken into part of the house, and they've added several square meters of property. That's what it looks like today. And there's the old front door. Inside, now there you can see the chunk that's been where the bay. This whole section here, where the bay has been squared up and added on, so they gained some square meters there, and rather nice ceilings. And we go on to Withicombe. Now this, we said earlier, was part of Skilpadvlei, transferred to Brink in 1896, and the homestead built in 1903 in the Cape Dutch style for Captain Francis George Pay, with 60 acres of land for export fruit growing. Now remember that, because we'll get back to export fruit later. And there's the house today. And in fact, there are some additional little rooms around the back which they rent out. So it's rented accommodation. I can't find the date for this map. It was given to me by the owner of Withicombe some years ago. And it's when it was being broken up and sold off. And you can see these properties were sold. This was not for sale. There's the original house, not for sale. And this section here, approximately 20 acres, for sale as complete or divided into 2. And if we look at it today, you find that the freeway cuts right through and just missed the house, luckily, which is sitting here. And this is that portion that could have been sold in one part or 2 parts. Okay, back to 1945, and you see Innisfree Road is there, and there's just vineyards here. nothing else, just vineyards. And then, if you look a little later, in 1953, a little house pops up. And what bothered me is that if there was an Innisfree Road, why was there an Innisfree Road? There's a Van Rijn Road, and there's a Brink Road, and these are all named after owners. But where did Innisfree come from? And it's spelt wrongly anyway. And you can see that there's a chunk of land that you saw in the aerial photographs, and it was granted to Tom, or Mr. T. Henshelwood, down the bottom there. Henshelwood of the old Henshellwoods of Claremont. And there in red you can see the property as it was divided up, and there's the house today, and it's still visible there. And I talked to the owners, and they've still got the old Innisfree sign. It was stuck in their garage. And these were all about 1945, these houses. And there's another one further down called Akersfield. Again, there's a drawing, and it was transferred to Mr. B.L.M. Newton in 1945. There in 45 there was nothing there. In 53 a house has popped up, and you can see today the same house is there, and there it is on Google picture, and it's just a house. Halfway through the century, I guess. Okay, Sunrise was another one, and Sunrise is where the sun, where the owner, Mr. Schudding, came when he gave his original Walloon farm to his son-in-law, and he moved to Sunrise, and that's a little further down on the same old map in 1945, and the properties are still there. It's called Lot Sunrise, you see at the bottom there. Sunrise Close, next to Walloon Road. Oh, it's interesting, Walloon Road goes along here, and then has a hiccup in it. And the reason is that Van Rijn Road came from that side, Van Rijn, and Walloon came from this side, and they didn't join. And then somebody had the bright idea of actually joining the two together. Okay, so there's the property, and there's the house, and it's impossible to photograph it because it's surrounded by all these extensions and whatever. But anyway, that's the farmhouse, and again, midway through the century. Vergezicht was on portion J of portion F of Schildpadvlei. And there, it's just on Van Rijn, the house is still there, and occupies that particular section of land when it was subdivided. So obviously it dates back prior to this, and the house is still there, and it's got these fancy gables on. Only one man living there apparently, very friendly chap, showed me round. Okay, so those are the areas that we've covered, except for panorama down the bottom here. So let's look at panorama. This is the earlier drawing that you saw for Fairview, and lot panorama is down the bottom here. And then at some stage, and I don't quite know why, it developed into this peculiar shape, and that lot at the top there became Hillcrest, and this section down the bottom here became Panorama. You see the name is down the bottom there, and it has a farm number as well. Okay, the reason I show you these, which are later subdivisions in 72 and 74, is that there are two roads, Castleview Road, shown here, and this whole development around there was called Castleview Estate and Castleview Close. And in 1953, there was a winery there, which was a bit odd. And there you can see the Castleview Estate there, and what's left of the winery at the back here. And there was actually a castle there. In 1975, Cape Argus picture, there was this castle. And the story is that during World War II, grapes could not be exported, so the Deciduous Fruit Board set up several wineries, one in Stellenbosch, one in Paarl, and the Constantia winery on Kendall Road. And the Italian Ugo Pacini made wine and spirits with Italian prisoners of war. KWV cleverly prohibited him by law from making quality wine because that would compete with them. Today he wouldn't get away with it. In 1945 he required a new tall French still to make spirits because he wasn't allowed to make quality wines. So he built a castle, a tower to house the still, based on a palace in Rimini, Italy. 3,000 tons of grapes were processed annually, and I spoke to somebody in that area who said that the deciduous fruit board people used to come round to their little small holding and pick all the grapes for them and take them off. In 1968 the winery closed and was demolished in the 1970s. So that's the Castleview estate, and that's what the winery looked like in 1968. And today it looks like that, and I walked around there and you can see where the castle used to be, and there's this leftover sheds that belong to the old winery, and it's now part of the waterworks area. And if you look at this little house here at the back there, that's, I can't date it, but that's perhaps one of the early farmhouses from the Panorama Farm. Okay, Timor Hall. Before the Fagans restored it in 1989, it had this rather grandiose look with lots of bricky lace and curly-whirlies. And it's dated on the gable there, 1796. And I'm not sure that that's correct, but I think they did a lot of research and decided that was a good date for it. Inside it's got some nice stained glass windows, and the history is that in 1789 Johann George Lochner was granted a lone farm along the Deep River. In 1804 he was given freehold title to 9 morgen called Diep Rivier, and in 1813, which is the date that Hoffman owned that other area of land, he owned Herstella and added 17 morgen to it. Edward George added 36 morgen, and he called the farm Halfway House. Now that's halfway between Cape Town and Simonstown. And don't forget, in those days there was no trains or buses or whatever. You went by coach or donkey or whatever, and you wanted a rest halfway through. So that was the Halfway House. That was then sold to C. Napier, to P.M. Dreyer, and many others. In 1873, Judge Coleman Fitzpatrick purchased 2 sections of land, and his son was the guy who wrote Jock of the Bushveld, which they're very proud of. Judge Fitzpatrick rented out Timor Hall estate with 70 morgen and 35,000 vines, and portions of land were sold off. And it was also rented out complete with slaves and horses and cattle and everything. In 1881, the widow of Charles Spinner Smith was Mrs. Aletta Jacoba Smith, and she owned 64 morgen, and she got the confirmed Cape Quit rent, which is what you see on the maps that we looked at earlier. Then it went on to Marais and Pfeiffer, who owned 20 morgen. 4 morgen was sold to Mrs. B. Townsend of Oak Farm. That's the Townsend that we heard about before. And the last 5.2 morgen were bought by Dr. D. Pfeiffer, and Mrs. Pfeiffer, when he had died, sold it to the provincial administration. In 1977 it became a national monument, and in 1989 it was restored by the Fagans. And there's an old map, 1800 map, and number 38 on the map is labelled in the key as Lochnar. So that shows that in 1800 there was at least a building there, but we don't know whether it was the building which we see today. In the 1813 map by Tybalt, he was commissioned to do a survey from Greenpoint area right through to Simonstown. He never got as far as Simonstown for some reason, but he did get from this area between Klastenbosch to Mr. Hoffman and Weinberg Camp. So Mr. Hoffman earned Herstella. I don't know why. That's Herstella, which later became Timor Hall. So the inn was acquired in 1815 by Edward George, who was the owner of George's Tavern in the Herengracht. And in 1816 he leased his halfway house together with horses, slaves and furniture to William Cutting and John Herbert and other people. In 1820 managed his establishment. In 1835 he went insolvent and the property was auctioned off. And the portion was sold to Thomas Frederick Dreyer, which became Weltervreden Farm that we saw earlier. He was an interesting guy. He had 5 wives, one of whom, with the error, Miss Mitchell, he neglected to marry, and 16 children, so her 2 were illegitimate. When he was insolvent, he owned £31,000, which is about 4 million today, which is why they had to sell off the estate. And there's a rather horrible map that I found in the archives, which I've charted up for you. And you can see the lot number 5 is this piece here is what became Belterfreden, and the Timor Hall house is shown down the bottom there. This lot here has been sold off for houses at the turn of the century. And at the bottom it says plan of the landed property of Mr. Edward George, situated in the Cape Division, known by the name Halfway House. Okay, this is another drawing of the same area, and it seems to be at the same time as they were auctioning off the property. But the interesting thing is the title at the bottom here, which I've transcribed, and it says the above diagram represents part of Halfway House establishment, contains 6 morgen, 295 square roods of freehold land, being part of the estate Hestella, now named Timor Hall. So that encapsulates the history for you. In 1881, the title deed of Mrs. Aletta Smith has shown these sections dating back to 1813, 1804, 1833, and the property of Mr. de Kock is shown down here. Mr. de Kock, property of Mr. van der Scheef. In 1898, this lot here was developed, and these sections here were available for housing. If you look at the estate itself, down the bottom here, there's Lady Mitchell, Lady Michaelis orthopedic home, and a number of roads which have been laid out. You can see this aerial photograph, again showing the early farms, and a couple of developments around there. This lot here, it was called Deirdriff at one stage, and that lot became the Patricia estate. Glen Constantia is on this land now behind Timor Hall. And when the estate was developed in 1897, they had these tiny little plots. And you can see that at least these ones here were consolidated. And if you look on the old Cape Town city drawings made from aerial photographs, you can see that this one occupies 3 or 4 plots because the ordinary plots were this size. And those 2 houses, quite similar. And there's 42 Timor Hall Road, built about 1902. There's 44, built about 1900. And 32, built in 1901. So it's the same sort of style. Okay, now we look at the one called Deirdriff, because there is an area there called Deirdriff, and I've never been sure quite why it was called Deirdriff. And it's also called, part of it was Middleton Farm at one stage. It was part of the Timor Hall estate, originally granted to Edward George, later transferred to J. Denace, and re-granted under the Land Beacons Act to Aletta Smith, which is why she got those the quit rent diagram for that, and then transferred to S.J. van Glerk in 1891. Now, this is a section of the drawing. In 1947, it's called the Deirdriff Subdivision Estate. Now, quite what that means, I don't know, but that lot there was Deirdriff. This is Van Rijn along here, and Lochner is down the back there. And this drawing I got from people who lived at one of these houses. It's a divisional council drawing, and I don't know where the others are, because it's very interesting that it shows just vineyards everywhere, and paddocks here, cultivation, vines, grass, stables, paddocks, fowl run, pigsty, stable, fruit, forage, cultivation, pine trees. So it gives you a nice overview of what the place was like in 1961, which is not that long ago. So, of these various buildings that are shown here, there's this one and those 2. This 1945 diagram shows that there's just bugger all there. And in 53, you've got it divided up. There's a little house there, there's something there, and here, and down the bottom there. Okay, if you translate that to today's diagram, you can see exactly where they are. And I spoke to this guy on the phone, who unfortunately was ill with prostate cancer, and he said that he was one of the first his was one of the first houses in that development, and it was only a one-bedroomed house, and he knew that across this donga here, that was the main farmhouse of that Deerdrift area. Yeah, you can see that's where I located his house, and the other one is on the other side over there, with a barn next door to it, in 1966. So there again, this is the Deerdrift subdivided estate. And there's Middleton Farm. That's this farmhouse here, and the barn next door to it. And it's a nice old, almost a cottagey farm. And the lady who lived in the barn said, no, it wasn't old, it couldn't be old. But if you look inside, it's kind of nice. Got a pleasant air to it. So that's the farmhouse, and that's the barn next door, both of which still exist today. So then Birmingham is another little one, fairly small chunk of land in this portion here. And there's a farmhouse shown on this 1961 drawing. And this is one of these survey diagrams where they've already shown the subdivision, even though it wasn't subdivided at this stage. And there's a house on these properties here, shown today. And if we look at it, there it is, a very funny looking house. It's almost as though there's a house and a garage which may have been converted into something else. Not clear. But the people there showed me round, and apparently it's back to front, because the front of the house used to be the other way. The road used to come up behind it, and this is the front. And you can see it's even got this sort of fake Elizabethan cantilever that's been added to it there, and rather interesting woodwork on the frontage. Okay, then we get to the Hermitage, and that's this little bit down the bottom here. And again, you see that on the diagram, 53. And this was transferred to S.J. van Blurk, Samuel J. van Blurk, down the bottom here. He died in 1896. And the interesting thing is that his death certificate shows that he lived at the Hermitage. So in other words, the Hermitage farm had already been built before 1896. So we don't know when. He took transfer in 1891. So between 1891 and when he died in 96. In 1928, I found this diagram. Adrian Jacobus Low applied for a township to be called the Hermitage. And the original transfer date that he quotes down here, title deed, blah, 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 was the farm was dated 1836 in favour of Charles Napier, owner of Timor Hall. Why he quoted that one and not a later one, I do not know, but the township was never built in any case. So, he died in 1931, he married twice with 10 children. He leased the Hermitage farm to his daughter whilst he still lived there, Hendrika Sibella Emerentia, who was married to Petrus Benjamin van Rijn, after whom Van Rijn Road is named, with an option to purchase. And his will is very complicated, and part of the option to purchase, he said that if she chose to purchase the farm, then she didn't qualify for any part of his estate. If she didn't opt to buy the farm, then she took her share. And I saw the receipt, in fact, she actually got her share. So obviously she was wise and she shut up until the estate had been divided up. And then later, she must have bought part of it because she sold portion A, which became Deerdrift Farm, and portion B. And in 1950, B and C were developed into the Patricia Township. You see sort of a diagram showing here. Patricia subdivided estate. And Hendrika van Rijn Low died in 61, and her name survives in Rika Low Avenue, which is right in front of the Hermitage. There you can see on the map where the house and the barn next door are located. And there's the house today. It's on a very large plot, and they tried. It's been subdivided so the front portion in front of the lawn could actually be sold off, but it would totally spoil the house, so they've decided not to do that. And inside it's very nice. That's a nice old marble fireplace, nice old ceilings, one of the lamps and a lovely ceiling rose, nice stained glass window in a door. And you notice that they've got the old-fashioned brass toggle switches. And they have a feeling that this was possibly the back door, but it's been added on. There's a huge kitchen that's been added to that, sort of kitchen come workroom, and it has an old or old-style fireplace with even a bakkuant built onto the back of it, and now it's been converted into bottle storage. Okay, so there's the property. The house is up the back there, and this double building here, part of it was the original barn. I don't know which part, which have also been converted into two separate residences. And interestingly, the Deep River meteorite fell through the farm in 1906. And nearly a kilogram meteorite fell through the stables. The fall was witnessed by Mr. Van Rijn, and there's somebody that I spoke to who actually lived there for a while and was shown by Mr. Van Rijn where the thing had come through the roof, which is, now it's a small cottage at the back of the house. And a specimen of that can be seen in the Museum of Cape Town. So, that shows you what we've dealt with in the last hour and a bit. 19 different houses that we've seen and covered, and you notice that we go as far as Hoofville Road, and up the top there is what we'll hear about next time, when Stephen Dalton will talk to you about the Hoofville area. Thank you.